Okay, so it's 6:30. I guess we'll get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Karina Kaushal. I am the Oakville host for the Girly Book Club. And while Erin and her lovely team is on a retreat in Italy, it's a host retreat related to the book club, Erin asked for a backup, and I was very excited to volunteer. I just finished this book last night, and I absolutely love it, so I'm very excited to talk to Rebecca Makkai. I can tell you a little bit about her. She's a Chicago-based author of novels such as The Great Believers, which we'll be talking about today, The 100-Year House, and The Borer, as well as some short stories, which has a collection called The Music of Wartime. The Great Believers was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and it received the ALA Carnegie Medal, and the LA Times Book Prize, among other honors. Makkai is on the MFA faculties of Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University, and she is Artistic Director of Story Studio Chicago. So that's a bit about her. And so, Rebecca, I think I'll give you a moment just to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sounds good. Hi, this is me. Everyone can hear me, I'm hoping. So I think so. I don't know. Yeah, I'm actually at Story Studio right now. This is there's a wall behind me. This is a place where I teach and do writing classes for people in Chicago and coordinate all kinds of stuff. I'm thrilled to be talking to you. You guys know that The Great Believers is my fourth book. This has been a really different experience for me, this book, both the writing and the publishing and everything that's happened since. It's, part of my growth, I think, as a writer, just to tackle something a little bigger this time, a little more difficult. And I'm assuming someone will ask at some point about where the book came from, and I'll talk about that at that point in time. But the book came out last June, hardcover, and then paperback has been this year. And I've been kind of all over the country and all over the world promoting it and doing stuff, and in a completely thrilling way. It's really partly because with this book, I don't just have to talk about myself all the time. I get to talk about the issues that I wrote about and the people I interviewed. And as I go around, I get to hear stories from other people about their experiences, which are sometimes quite intimate with the AIDS epidemic. So this has been a really wild trip, and maybe I'll kind of leave it at that, knowing that maybe in a minute we'll get into the story of the book and things like that.
Okay. Just getting new to this technology as well. So one of the very popular questions that we got was, as you said, what was your inspiration for the book, and why did you choose to focus on the AIDS crisis?
Yeah, okay. So this is a long answer. I'm going to give you the long answer, though. And this is the longest answer I'll give. I won't normally drone on this much. But and I'm assuming here that I'm talking to people mostly who've read the book, so spoilers are okay, right?
That's right.
Basically, okay, all right. I'll say that the book started with Nora. I wanted to write Nora's story. I had this idea of writing the story of an artist's model, someone who was an artist's muse in a time when that was considered maybe akin to prostitution, but at a time when women who wanted to be artists didn't really have the resources for a career in the arts. But when being a muse could be its own kind of career. And I didn't want to set it in the World War I era. I didn't want to write a historical novel really to that extent. Of course, I ended up writing one. So I thought I would set it at the end of her life looking back, which put her in the 80s. And once I had the art world in the 80s, I felt like that was an opportunity to write about the AIDS epidemic, which is something... just as a sidebar, I really came of age with the AIDS epidemic. I was born in 1978. I became aware of the world as the world was becoming aware of AIDS. I became aware of pop culture as AIDS was seeping into pop culture. I became aware of sex as AIDS was coming into our sex ed. This was really the backdrop to my childhood in a lot of ways, even though no, my parents were not taking me to gay bars in 1985 when I was 7 years old. I did not, I was not part of that world. So it felt very natural to me to be wanting to write about something that was the biggest issue in the world that I was born into. I thought at first that AIDS was going to be a bit of a subplot. And I really was going to focus on the story of Nora. One of the things that's happened, and some people might have seen where I've told this story before, but I had this idea of Nora's story being introduced because she's watching the news and this painting comes on the news of dubious authenticity. Some people think it's by this famous artist. Other people say it's not. She alone knows the truth because it's a painting of her. And so she needs to contact people in the art world and start to tell her story. And that's our way into her story. So this is what I was planning. And I was thinking about this book for months. And I was getting ready to go off to a residency, an artist residency, to start working. And my husband asked before I left what I was going to be working on. And I told him this whole story about this woman and the news and the painting. And he very sweetly and gently goes, honey, you know, that's the plot of the movie Titanic, with, where, you know, she's watching the news and they bring up that sketch and she's like, that's me. And then that's the intro to her story. So that was a problem. That was a really big bummer for me. This book that I'd been plotting out and dreaming about turned out to basically be a retelling of the Titanic. But I knew that I still had something there. I got to this residency and I'd been doing a lot of reading. It was easier by far for me to find research, to find information about Paris, the Paris art world of the teens and 20s than it was to find about AIDS in Chicago, which is disturbing, but was starkly the case. So I'd been reading a lot about Paris. And one of the things I found was this quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald saying, "We were the great believers." Mm-hmm. And I thought that was so strange. He's talking about his generation, this generation we think of as so jaded and debauched. But he was really talking about that generation before the war. And I'd been reading about the visual artists who came to Paris before the war from all over to study. They're finding chosen family. They're living in poverty, but they have each other. And then the war and the influenza of 1918 both roll through and decimate that generation, largely of its young, able-bodied men. Really weird thing about that flu, it killed young men. And it's in the aftermath of all of that the American writers we think of go to Paris. And that's when Gertrude Stein calls them a lost generation. And that transition from the great believers to the lost generation, I found so interesting. And I started to see these incredible parallels to this AIDS generation of a city like Chicago. These people who'd come from all over, young men coming from small towns, coming to the city, finding each other in this brief sort of post-Stonewall glow, finding happiness, and then this plague descends. So I knew I did, although I was freaked out that I'd accidentally started writing Titanic, I knew I did have the beginnings of a novel. And the novel really started with those parallels between those two generations.
Thanks for sharing that. That was very interesting. And then kind of stemming from what you said about Nora and her story, it's interesting to find out that's where it started, because one of the other questions we got was, it sounded like you were...
Sorry, there's someone above me like bowling or something. I don't know what's going on. Oh. Sorry about the noise. Go ahead.
Okay. So we got a question saying that this book felt kind of like two separate stories. And could you have written only about HIV in the gay community during the 1980s? And do you think that would have been a good enough story?
No, I tried it. It didn't work. I think that anytime, this is the thing about writing, anytime you do like, you put three characters in and everyone's like, each could have been their own novel, or you put two people, they each could have been their own novel. In this case, I tried writing it only about the 80s. I tried writing it only about Yale. It was very limited. There wasn't that long scope on things. We didn't have, for me, I think I had more concerns about appropriation, about whose story this was to tell when I was writing only Yale's story, making it more of a polyphonic novel. helped a great deal. But also, so much of my research was interviews, was conversations with people in Chicago. And in those conversations, I realized that the most fascinating thing to me was this 30-year gap, this long arm of history. And the way that grief has just flowed through the bystanders, the helpers, the way the PTSD goes through generations. And I think what you would have if you had only Yale's story, you would have the splash of the rock in the pond. You would not have the ripples. And I think the ripples are always more interesting than the splash in some way, or they help you understand the splash. The metaphor might fall apart there. I'm not sure that ripples literally help you understand a splash, but in fiction they do. I think that, sure, you could pull apart those threads and you could say, yes, I could have told just this story, but I think when people think that way, I don't think they're understanding everything that would be lost in terms of the repercussions, in terms of the echoes. No, I tried it. It didn't work. It wasn't the story I wanted to tell.
I would have to agree. I think that it was really good the way it was written. It added so multiple layers to it and so much more emotion, I feel like. So another question is, can you talk a bit about the research and like how did you learn so much about?
Yeah, right. So I was writing across difference in some fundamental ways, one of which is that I'm not a gay man. The generational difference was really the most difficult one. Things that I would have assumed that I knew and absolutely don't. The story I'm always telling on myself is that in chapter 3, in my original draft, Yale's walking down North Halsted Street in Chicago and he's looking for his friends. And he's walking past bars that I know very well. We've been there since the 80s. And I had him looking through the windows for his friends. You cannot look through the window of a gay bar in 1985. Right. And that's something that I couldn't have learned from a book. I could not have guessed. And when I've said that to gay men my age, they haven't gotten it either. They've been like, what's the problem? It's a generational thing, right? And that had to come about in conversation as someone was sitting there with me in Dunkin' Donuts telling me about the bar scene. So I started off with basically, here's what happened. I started reading the big, important nonfiction books about AIDS, How to Survive a Plague by David France, and The Band Played On by Randy Schultz, which I do recommend, but anyone who reads that, you have to ignore anything he says about Patient Zero, which has been completely disproven, but it's still a really important book. All those books, they were really helpful. Chicago, though, wasn't even in the index. This is America's third largest city. It was really hard hit. It's not even in there. So I headed to our big library downtown, the Harold Washington Library, knowing that what I would find there would be kind of big, dusty, dry academic books, like someone's sociology dissertation turned into a book or whatever, but I was ready for that. What I was not ready for was finding 0 books about AIDS in Chicago. And that's the case. I looked for 5 years. There are a couple of memoirs that talk about the 90s. There are some pages of a big coffee table book about gay Chicago. There are some online oral archives. Archives, I could find some stuff, but the books that I was looking for that I assumed would be there are not there. We lost thousands of people and there's no book. And that's not what I've written. I've written a novel. So my next step was to get into archives. And I did have in the Harold Washington Library every back issue of the Windy City Times, which is Chicago's biggest gay weekly. So I read every word of every issue from 85 to 92, like op-eds, news from the city, news from around the world, ads for $85 VHS cassettes because they'd just been invented, absolutely everything. And having that groundwork laid, I was ready to interview people. I didn't want to go into interviews being like, so what was it like? I wanted to be able to ask really informed questions. And so I started reaching out first on Facebook, actually, to my own friends saying, were you out in Chicago in the 80s? Do you know people who were, who'd be willing to talk? reassuring them that I was not going to base any characters or plot lines on them. I already had my characters. I'd already started to write. I just needed detail. You make a different commitment to reality and to realism with every project, with every fiction project. I could have, for instance, made up a fictional city, or I could have called it Chicago but made up the bars and made up the events. It felt, though, for this story, which reflects some people's real lived history, like I had to be as granularly accurate as possible. There are only a few things that I took liberties with, which I note all of in the author's note. So I needed that accuracy. So I sat down and, the first few people I met with might have been a little bit off from what I was looking for. Someone who'd moved here, for instance, in '92 to work for ACT UP. But I'm still going to talk to him. And at the end of every conversation, I was saying, who are the next 3 people you think I should speak to? And then not only were they recommending people, but they were making the introductions often. They were vouching for me. And before long, I found myself talking to doctors, nurses, lawyers, journalists, archivists, activists, the art therapist from Illinois Masonic Hospital, the woman who brought the AIDS quilt to Navy Pier, and survivors, people who lost lovers and friends, long-term survivors who'd been living with HIV since the early 80s before there was a test. And they were so generous. It was on details, it was on vibe, it was on ambiance. Several of them also read the book before it went to my editor. And I asked them to just, let me know anything that seemed the slightest bit off. I needed them to be completely honest with me on tone, on detail. I got notes on like the stickiness level of this one bar floor. I mean, just anything. Okay. I became very close to a lot of them. I found myself in a therapist role with a few of them. With others, just these are people that I learned so much from. I was writing this from 2013-ish to 2017-ish, which, was an interesting time politically in our country, as it continues to be. And having the voices of these fighters, these survivors in my ears got me through, and it taught me so much.
Okay. That was another question, how long it took you to write. So 2013 to 2017, that's quite some time.
Yeah, four-ish years. I was researching and writing both the whole time. Okay. And it depends what you count. Like, does the thinking about it but not typing phase count? Does the phase where you don't do anything for 3 months but then suddenly you get copy edits, does that count? But yeah, I think I started it in I think I started it I started thinking about it in 2014. And I turned in the last edits, late 2017. So whatever that means, but I would say 3 or 4 years, which for literary fiction is about right. Everyone's first novel takes them like 10 years. My first novel took me 10 years. And then it's not that it gets easier, but you start to know your own process, and you start to prioritize it because you know that this is maybe a viable thing someone's waiting for. And so 3 or 4 years is about right for literary fiction. I have friends who write, commercial, like they write mystery series or historical romance, and they are shooting out a book a year. And they work way harder than, not way harder. They have a more intense work ethic than a lot of other writers I know, where, you ask them out for lunch and they're like, I can't, I'm in the book bunker. And you're like, okay. So I have nothing but respect for those people who put out a book a year, but that's fortunately and unfortunately both not what I do.
Okay, so now that you've done all this research and spent so much time and have so much knowledge, I think everybody's burning question is whether there's a sequel coming, and will we see more of Fiona?
No sequel. Definitely no sequel. That said, we have sold the option for TV rights to Paper Kite Productions, which is Amy Poehler's production company. They just did Russian Doll, so it's not all comedy. Something being optioned does not mean it's going to be made. The next step is to go to networks and see if someone, like HBO, Hulu, Showtime kind of place wants to actually make it happen. The chances are always remote that anything gets made, but I'm hopeful it's in really good hands. And if that's the case, I will stay involved creatively. And I would be really interested in the storylines that we could expand. We'd be looking at a limited series, what they used to call a mini series, but now apparently we call them limited series, but 8 or 10 episodes. Although, then there's that thing, if this happened and if it were successful, if they wanted a second season, do you maybe follow one character to another city and do something else over there? So it's not out of the question. But no, I had this question as I wrote of how far towards the end of anyone's life do I take this story? My original ending that I had envisioned was the scene that is in the book of Yale visiting Charlie finally in the hospital and giving him water with a sponge. And I felt like that was it. And then I was just going to leave it, and you don't really know what happens. And I ultimately felt like I couldn't flinch. I couldn't look away from what this was. I couldn't let people die off stage, which I think a lot of AIDS narratives do, or a lot of mainstream narratives that use AIDS as a subplot, which is one reason I did not want to use AIDS as a subplot ultimately myself. I didn't want it being implied that maybe someone had died, but you don't know. Or the main character goes to visit their friend in the hospital and, oh my goodness, the bed is empty, and the main character learns something about life. Okay. That didn't feel right. I felt like if I was going to do this, I need to do it. And if I'm going to do it, I ultimately realized as I was writing, I need to go right up to the end of things. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for sequels down the road, right? But you never know. I mean, it was really a joy for me in the middle of all of this to be able to give some characters the gift of survival. And, not always the characters you would think. And that was, this is obviously emotionally a very hard book to write. And and spoiler alert here, did anyone skip ahead if they're watching the video and they haven't finished the book, but bringing Julian back, towards the end in Fiona's sections, it gave me so much joy. I couldn't wait to get to that moment. I couldn't wait to be able to tell everyone that and to reveal that. I think that people, if nothing else, whether or not the TV thing happens, I think readers can envision a life for him. I know a lot of Julians now, and they've had really full lives. So,
would you maybe not write about a sequel, but maybe write about the same era again?
Probably not. The book I'm working on now is set partly in the 90s, but it's a really different milieu. And no, I think one of the things about usually with literary fiction is you're always trying to do something new. You're not trying to replicate or to continue. I get bored and allergic to what I've already done. I still am very attached to this story, but I don't think it would be healthy for me to dive into the same world. And to try to, are you trying to replicate? What are you trying to do exactly? So I'm writing something utterly different, but no, I think that, I'm eager to see what other things come out of the story as it is in terms of movies, in terms of theater, whatever might happen. There's a photographer here in Chicago who started this is not a continuation of my book, but she started a project called the Julian Project, based on this idea of Richard's photos of Julian, these photos of a survivor. And she's trying to basically find early photos of people who've been long-term living with HIV and then take new portraits of them and display them side by side. So I'm thrilled at things like that happening. Even things like I get to see, right now a lot of my European translations and Asian translations are coming out, and I get to see the covers, just the covers. Like that's another work of art that has something to do with the book. The translation itself is a continuation of the book. So
someone actually asked about that. They said that they noticed all the different, someone actually asked about that. They said they noticed all the different covers across the world, and they wanted to know if you had a favorite one and what your influence was on those cover designs.
Well, it's not, I don't have an influence because I don't design the covers, but I get, maybe veto power, not really. I particularly actually love the paperback of the US edition, just the brightness of it, the way it stands out. But the French cover, which I just saw the final version of today, so I don't think it's online. It's called Les Optimistes in French, like the optimists. That's basically the way that a lot of cultures are translating the title. It's this beautiful photo of this group of friends walking down the street from some kind of protest or parade, kind of really in the 70s, which you can tell from their clothes, but it doesn't matter. It's just a gorgeous, like, black and white photo. And it looks very French. It's a cover that works in France, but wouldn't work here. Different things work in different places. So I like that a lot. I like and I haven't seen them all yet. I'm just starting to see certain ones, and some are the same. Like the Dutch cover is the same, except it's like, Dutch always sounds like you're just making it up. Like it's like degree de bolibus. So it's like this kind of like it's like almost English, but not. It's not quite that, but it's something like that. So we'll see. There are a lot that I haven't seen yet that I'm excited about.
Okay. So it looks like some people in the chat window are very interested in your writing process. And somebody's asked, was it challenging to only speak from Fiona's point of view? Was it challenging to only speak as her in one period, but not have her as a consistent narrator throughout the novel?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I think that I got to know Fiona first as that third person character in the 80s. I didn't introduce her sections until I'd written about 120 pages of Yale and then realized I needed Fiona and I needed the present day. And Fiona was someone who had just she appeared because I was writing that initial party scene. No one ever start your book with a party scene. It's a terrible idea. It's just way too many, like, hopefully I made it work, but it's like, how are you going to get people straight and introduce everyone? It's just a mess. But I was like, okay, well, at least maybe not literally everyone at this party is a man. I will throw in one woman. And I threw her in. And in the earliest draft, it wasn't her brother who had died. It was some other guy named Elon. In the earliest drafts, Nora had no relation to Fiona. Fiona was she was a person whose brother had died, who was in this group of friends, and that's who she was. And then she came back. I had this other scene where Yale is crying on her shoulder outside of that fundraiser party around Christmas time. And this detail about her big earrings that her brother always thought would get caught in things. And I really liked her. There had been a photo that someone I kind of know, a writer, had posted online of herself and some friends in the 80s. And it's this, I know her now as this woman in her 50s, but she was just like, she had her head thrown back in laughter and this wild hair and these friends around her. And that was Fiona to me. And so when I introduced her as a narrator later, and narrator in the third person, of course, I'm not really speaking in her voice, it was that question of, who is the same person that I know so well? Who is she 30 years later? That was a challenge. Like, it's the same character. There needs to be enough consistency there. But 30 years is a long time. And how do I make her both the same and different? How do I make this a continuation of the same person? And how do I show her then through the rest of the 80s turning into the person we're going to know in 2015? So yeah, it was a fun challenge is what I would say. I enjoyed her as a character. I have very little in common with her. She's the person who's demographically more like me, but I have way more in common with Yale. I wrote Yale way closer to myself. She's just kind of like a wild character that I had fun with. But I was never tempted, to tell things through her point of view in the 80s, for instance, just because it never had been her story.
Okay. And then somebody's asked here if they could know more about your writing process. So for example, if you knew that Yale would die before you started writing the book, or if you decided it while you were writing.
I did not know that at the outset. Like I said, I think my original plan was to leave things halfway, and then I realized that wasn't going to work. This metaphor is not original to me, but the metaphor that I think I always tell my students is that you do need an outline, but your relationship to your outline is like your relationship for your itinerary on a trip to a place you've never been before. So I'm going to go to Rome. I've never been to Rome before. I'm going to plan some stuff out. I'm going to make some reservations. I'm going to look up some museums. I have a basic idea. But then you get there and it's raining one day. You run into a friend. This restaurant's closed. There's a cool store. You don't want to be walking around with the itinerary like, it says that on Tuesdays we go. You want to be free to do what you find when you get there. You also don't want to go without any plan at all. That would be, and you don't know what's going on and you're just wandering around blindly. So I always have a plan, and then I'm very much at liberty to leave that behind and to do something else. So there were certain things, I changed my mind a million times about a million different things. For a while, my plan was, I had not introduced Fiona's sections yet. I knew that I needed to bring it into the present day, what was then the present day. And my original thought was, I'm going to reveal at the end that Julian has been narrating this whole thing, which would have been a kind of a weird move, but that was the moment where I was like, okay, but that I knew he had survived at least. So that part stayed, but his narrating it didn't. Other things, you just find yourself writing them. I originally only writing in the 80s. Richard, for instance, was really originally just this kind of guy who took a lot of photographs. And suddenly I have 2015 and I find myself writing that Fiona's going to stay with him. And I'm giving him this whole life as this really famous photographer, which is not something I had anticipated doing. But with Yale, I think I probably really answered this previously, but it was a matter of realizing that it would be a cop-out in a lot of ways to have the one person you're really rooting for be the one person who makes it. It just doesn't work that way. And it wasn't going to work. And I needed to not flinch. Like I said, I also needed to provide enough hope in this book. It could not be all downhill all the time. So I needed to look for where there was hope, where there was joy, where there was humor. That title became sort of a North Star to me, having landed on it. Like, what do they believe in? What does this mean? So yeah, I just, you're kind of feeling it out in the dark.
I just want to add that when you said that you didn't want to leave things hanging, I feel like the opportunity to see all the characters and confront all their situations till the end was really good. And I think it kind of you didn't baby us and hide things from us. You just showed us the reality of their situation. So I think that was good.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
What did it feel like for you to find out that you were a Pulitzer finalist?
It was great. It was a bit of a roller coaster. It was, that was, you find out after you find out who won. So it's not like there are finalists announced and then they announce the winner. That is the way the National Book Award works. And that's the way the Carnegie Medal worked. So National Book Awards, you find out the long list, which is 10. Then you find out you made the short list. Then you go to this ceremony that's like the Oscars for writers, and there's a red carpet, and it's recorded, and and they announce it live. So that was really fun, but a lot of stress. The Pulitzer, I will say, what happened is the book, people love to speculate online, and so as much as I wanted to be completely unaware of when the Pulitzer was being announced, people kept tagging me on Twitter with my Pulitzer predictions. And they're find out on Monday. And so I knew it was happening. I knew I wouldn't be able to concentrate on anything else. So I did watch the live cast of the announcements, but they only announced the winners. And it's this really anticlimactic thing. It's people in a conference room at Columbia University. The Pulitzer doesn't work like a lot of people think. There's a nominating committee of a few writers and critics. They pick 3 finalists for each category, or each committee, has its own category. And those finalists are passed on. And the actual Pulitzer committee is the journalism faculty of Columbia University in New York, along with Juno Diaz, who teaches fiction there, and Catherine Boo, who's a nonfiction writer. But it's mostly journalists. So not exactly the kind of big they that people might think, but it's a cool system. Anyway, so I watched the live cast, and the exact book that I thought would win won, The Overstory by Richard Powers, which a very smart bookseller told me like a year earlier was going to win, and I believed him. I did know there was this possibility of being a finalist and that I wouldn't find out until later. So I went on Twitter to see if I could find anything out, and there was nothing up. I got involved in some random conversation on Twitter about something stupid, and then someone tagged me, and it was a picture of a stack of The Overstory, There by Tommy Orange, and my book. And she's saying, congratulations to the winner and the two finalists. I was one of the nominating judges this year. But I didn't know if she was legit, or because she could have been a crazy person just making this up, right? So, and then my hands were shaking so badly. So what I took my phone and I took a picture of my computer screen and I texted it to my agent, asking her if this was true. And then she managed to find out that it was. But it was pretty great. I was at a writing residency, actually, near Chicago, so close to home, but at a writing residency in my room, and I just knocked on other people's doors, and everyone came out. We were all in our pajamas, and we went down and we drank Prosecco and had chocolate in the middle of the day, and it was awesome.
That sounds amazing. So these author talks have made the book so much richer, for me anyways, and for sounds like people in the chat window as well, to really get inside your head and understand what your intentions were with the characters was helpful. And would you be interested in having us follow you and your process in a future book that you could be planning?
Yeah, so are you asking me what I'm writing right now? What are you asking?
It looks like she just wants to know, yeah, I guess so. If you could tell us a little bit more about.
I can do that. Yeah. I'm working on a new novel. I'm working on it more in my head than on my keyboard, but that's still work. But it is, it's utterly different. I'll say though, I've lived for quite a long time now on the campus of the boarding school where my husband teaches. And I'm finally writing a boarding school novel. It's not prep. It's not that. It's a kind of a dark thing. And what I've been telling people is like, it's like a combination. It's like a cross between the first season of Serial, The Secret History, The Big Chill, and Lysistrata. It's like an angry feminist thing. But it's also, there's a murder. But it's realistic. It's not, I don't know. So that's what I'm working on. And it'll be like 2022 or so before it's out. 3 or 4 years, like we said, between projects for literary fiction is about right. And in this case, there's been so much travel and promotion for this book that it's really going to be 4 instead of 3. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed talking with you and hearing more about your writing process and what you were, as you were writing the book. I think everyone really appreciated your time. We'd love to, hear from you again in the future, hopefully, when there's another book.
Yeah, absolutely. People can, follow me on Twitter or Facebook if they want to see what I'm up to. And I'll, I'm publishing short stories and stuff in the meantime. And I'm always thrilled to meet people as I tour and thrilled to get emails from readers and all of that. So thank you all so much.
You're also coming to Toronto very soon, right?
Yes, I am. Yeah. In October. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So we'll look out for that.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for chatting with us, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a good night.
Bye.